Hi, everyone. I'm Arjun Chandar, CEO of IndustrialML, and I'm happy to welcome back an advisor to our company, Adam Nathan, the utility practice manager at Worldwide Technology. Adam, good to see you again.
Great to see you too.
So we wanted to talk today about one of the biggest problems that's facing manufacturing and will be over the next decade, which is the skills gap across manufacturing and the lack of ability to fill it. And we want to talk a little bit about potentially solutions that could better address that.
So Arjun, what's the problem today? Could you help describe the situation?
Well, manufacturing workforces have trended older and older as time has gone on. But with baby boomers retiring at record rates, manufacturers are losing quite a bit of workforce and quite a bit of skill. And this trend is likely to continue over the next 10 years. Deloitte did a great study about a year ago where they determined that in the US alone, there's an expectation that 2.1 million jobs in manufacturing are going to go unfilled just because of the skills gap within manufacturing. And for a very long time, across manufacturing and other industries, there's been a tendency to hire within a fixed talent pool. When people quit, you go back to the same pool of workers to find new people to fill that role. And that's not necessarily been good for people who haven't been trained in those skills. It means that they've been excluded from the market. But manufacturers have, for the most part, been able to get away with it because that talent pool has stayed the same size. But with these workforce retirements, there's a shrinking talent pool. And it's harder and harder to fill that with new workers because of the fact that they haven't necessarily been provided with those skills coming into the job. So manufacturing right now is largely a hire for will, train for skill environment for new workers. And that's a very risky proposition for manufacturers because if you were to look at the average tenure of somebody who's 55 to 64, that's 9.9 years generally. But for 25 to 34-year-olds, they typically only stay in a job for about 2.8 years, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So there's a significant investment and a high risk investment in hiring for will and training for skill for manufacturers. And there's nothing preventing a recently trained employee from leaving to a competitor. So the end result of this is you have 1.8 job openings for every out of work worker. You have a very large out of work force that doesn't necessarily have the skills coming in to be able to fill the jobs that manufacturers need. And you have manufacturers with a shrinking, ever more expensive pool of workers, but still the same, in fact, increasing requirements for quality and productivity. And if you were to talk to 8 out of 10 manufacturers, they would tell you that inability to hire and properly train their workforce in an efficient manner is by far their biggest problem, and it's an existential threat to them.
Yeah, I'm seeing it across industries in the industrial space. I talked to a guy at an underground gas storage facility in the Midwest the other day, and he said, I asked him how long did it take before he made a major critical decision on his own without referring to one of the more tenured folks. He said it took 5 years, right? And so if it is a 5-year ramp up period, and that person, after 5 years, there's no barrier for them to go leave into a job market where people are being offered more and more money because of the shrinking pool of existing talent. You can't backfill fast enough. And the cost to an organization to do their own training is incredibly high. So I couldn't agree more. I guess, have you seen this? What's the impact on a small manufacturing, the owner of a small manufacturing business?
Well, let's take a typical factory that might have 200 people working for it. What they're staring at right now is that this workforce is probably going to diminish to 165 to 170 over the next 2 years. And I mean, that is an existential risk to your factory's productivity when you get cut by that much, because ultimately those positions are filled by a number of people who have been there for years and years and know all of the little things that make the factory run, that, like you said, can take 5 or 6 years to properly train in a new employee.
Right. That's it's not your new employees that are leaving. This is the institutional knowledge that's walking out the door.
Right. And so it is possible, obviously, to run your line with fewer workers and, to be able to figure out how to be more efficient. But when you're looking at attrition of that degree, it is almost impossible to maintain consistency in both your operations and your operational practices. And having consistency in both of those things is absolutely critical to maintaining your overall output of the factory. So being able to still get the same level of human productivity that you used to have, if you can't do that, your factory can't continue to exist. And that's essentially what a lot of small factories are really, really worried about over the next 10 years.
Right. And I think the pandemic, the great reshuffle or resignation, the just the volatility in daily life has created a scenario where you need even more room for error from a staffing perspective at a time where you're expected to run with none at all, basically.
Yeah. And again, I'll go back to that Deloitte study just as a few examples. 79% of the manufacturers they talked to said that it would affect their ability to implement new technology. 79% said it would affect their ability to respond to new market opportunities. 81% said it would affect their ability to maintain their production levels to be able to satisfy customer demand. And when that's a situation that you're in, that has huge shocks across the entire market. So it's a societal problem, but it's also one that almost every manufacturer in the US has explicitly listed as something they're really concerned about.
Absolutely. So on top of other supply chain woes, this is another source of concern for the overall global supply chain. So theoretically, what's the approach that could address this market demand?
Well, and I've mentioned hire for will, train for skill. That's actually something that I heard from Ben Armstrong, the executive director of MIT's Industrial Performance Center. And his research has largely talked about the macro level solutions to this. And if we're talking about hiring for will and training for skill, the macro level solution is making it easier to hire skill by increasing the baseline skill of the market. So this is something that governments, local officials, sometimes conglomerates of companies are trying to do relatively poorly. But things like more encouragement of vocational education, more incentive for apprenticeships, more manufacturing education at a high school level, and just an industry-wide practice of providing incentives for, say, shop floor entrepreneurship. Those are all ideas to make it easier for workers to be mobile from company to company because they have the skills to go to more companies. And that's obviously a great goal to have, and certainly something that I would encourage everyone to try to support to the greatest degree possible. But it is a macro level solution. And for the individual factory, that's something that's very hard to wait on, because adjusting the baseline level of skill in the workforce is a years-long endeavor. In fact, a decades-long endeavor. But the typical factory doesn't necessarily have that long to be able to adjust for the highly uncertain market that exists today.
So how can a factory today invest in a way to address that need?
Well, there is quite a range of current solutions that are out there. There is the one that's very popular to talk about in the media, which is all right, let's just bypass this problem altogether. Let's make a fully autonomous factory floor, get rid of workers, and just be able to, run efficiently with high quality of productivity with, just with robots. Well, at a minimum, that's unrealistic. Um, the reality is that human intuition is and always will be really important in manufacturing. And while the nature of work might be shifting, and there's a certain level of technical and digital skill that's more important now than it was in the past, the vast majority of brownfield companies and small manufacturers are just never going to get globally autonomous. It's too high of a capital expenditure. It doesn't even necessarily fit every manufacturing process. And I mean, generally speaking, because of how much that's talked about in the media, people don't want to advertise that too much.
Right. This is the equivalent of, we're not getting from manual driving to self-driving. It's more of, we're seeing a man plus machine. This is
exactly.
Let's automate parallel parking and make cruise control more dynamic, not take the human completely out of the equation.
Yeah. Now, another option is, we'll say, digital twin technology. So AR, VR technologies that provide human assistance. And I'm not knocking that in any way. I actually think that's quite powerful as a technology, and it's had documented benefits for, say, training on new product assembly, and certainly in field service. But it's essentially the run of crawl, walk, run, if you're a typical manufacturer. And there's not really a mechanism to, say, refresh those models or really get feedback from the people that are using them, except, still manual communication. Once again, that also is something that requires significant digital investment. And there are plenty of manufacturing processes where the specific mechanics of how the human is supposed to move are not particularly relevant to properly training them. So again, very powerful technology, but limited in its scope. Now, the last one that we see a lot is the more traditional training approach. So, classroom learning or digital platforms. And again, I'm a huge proponent of lifelong education. I think it's quite valuable for workers of all stripes to continue to take courses as they can. But it's limited in its pace of training effectiveness, because essentially people are learning in the classroom, and then they have to go onto the plant floor and try to apply what they've learned. And what they've learned might not specifically apply to the process that they're studying right now. So there's a significant benefit to learning by doing on the plant floor, and learning by doing in engineering as well. For instance, if you're a manufacturing engineer and you're looking at a highly nuanced manufacturing process, there are certain troubleshooting practices that you're just never going to get from classroom learning. So that particular encouragement of learning by doing, coupled with the ability to gather and document best practices and refresh the training models that you're using, while still understanding you have a dependency on workers, that's the particular gap that we see with current solutions.
Right. I think back to that gentleman I spoke to at the underground gas storage facility, when he said a critical decision. You're in that moment. He doesn't have time to go back to the classroom and look it up. It has to be presented to him, and he needs something that helps him in that moment.
Yeah. Well, and you also don't have the ability to just go and look up your company's manuals.
Right.
That the particular section of that manual that is relevant to you needs to come to you in that moment.
Right.
And that specifically is the sort of thing that can take years to really understand.
So tell me a little bit about how IML is working to solve and fill the skills gap.
Well, that is what our platform really provides as an opportunity. for manufacturers, a pathway to make training for skill better, cheaper, and faster, and possible to do in real time. Our platform offers navigation and communication modules and all of the know-how that we've talked about in the factory, such as, hey, your furnace temperature is too high, so you need to go back and check your pre-wash bath temp. That particular know-how can be stored as part of, say, our real-time notification system's alert messages. And at the time that happens, an operator can get a specific real-time notification delivered to a headset or to a mobile app, which lets them know that specific troubleshooting step, which has been documented over the course of years of best practices, but which it may not have necessarily memorized. That particular transfer of real-time know-how that enables somebody who has perhaps only a few months of experience to do the job at least 90% as well as someone with 5 years of experience, that's the value that we can provide. Now, another thing is, because we capture audio communications on the production floor, we can determine what are the actions that people are actually taking when situations like that occur in production. What are the typical practices that people actually follow, even if it's not a critical situation, just like a normal situation? What are the things that people actually do? And because of the fact that we can capture that, we can always go back and refresh the incoming data to accommodate what the factory's true best practices are. And by disseminating that and refreshing it, we can help factories actually achieve some consistency in their operations and their practices without being dependent on one or two individual workers who they have to keep for 40 years. For the factory, you can significantly reduce the time and the cost of training and de-risk the investment that you're making in hiring for will and training for skill. It allows you to continue to operate and potentially find employees from a larger pool of available workers, and still be able to operate in an environment where it's highly uncertain whether people are going to stay for a while. But for the employees as well, it provides a huge benefit in that it expands the number of companies that they can continue to work for and the number of companies that they can move to going forward. It also means that they can pick up skills as they work much more quickly than they ever could before. They don't need to commit to 5 years working at a company to consider themselves an expert at something. And that combination of things at more of a micro level rather than the macro level that we talked about allows individual companies to have a robust way to document and impart everything that's needed to run their operations.
Absolutely. It's a win-win.
Win-win-win for everybody.
Yeah. But I think I find most compelling about this approach is it's not broad, sweeping, industry-wide, huge capital outlay kind of approach that the largest manufacturers are taking and that the news reports on with new facilities being built. It addresses what truly is an underserved majority in this space. The family-owned 1, 2, 3 manufacturing plant organization that has 100 to 1,000 workers that rely on it to feed their families, that have worked with many people who have worked for decades and are ready to retire, that are putting the industry at risk by retiring. And so this allows us to backfill for those people in a more seamless way. It provides a path to meaningful, valuable work for many more people. And it leverages the existing massive investment we as a society have made in manufacturing today without needing to rip and replace everything from the machines to the people. I think it's much more realistic and a more valuable approach in 2022.
Yeah, well, and I think it's somewhat of a logical fallacy to think that, if my grand vision is to make manufacturing an exciting, innovative space for people to create value, you don't necessarily need to automate in order to accomplish that. so long as you can make it possible to pick up skills quickly and be able to perform and do something valuable without having to be there for a decade, manufacturing can be creative, innovative, exciting for everybody. Well, thanks so much for the time, Adam. It's great talking to you as always, and I look forward to doing it again very soon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, and as always, you can visit us at industrialml.com or email us at info@industrialml.com to find out more. Thanks, everyone.